Pythagoras was in a boy band.
How are things on your end?
Good, man. Good. I had mistakenly went on Twitter right before this, just killing time, and saw a bunch of stuff about degrowth, and I almost lost my mind. Now I'm all triggered.
What? So did you tweet anything?
No, I didn't tweet anything. I just saw a bunch of. The worst part is always when it's like workmates and stuff, and I'm just like, oh god.
I feel like that when like a subject comes up just in life that we've talked about on the podcast a lot before, because I'm like, I have so much to say on this, but this poor person has.
Is
I don't want to
prepared to deal with my rants.
So I tend to nod along much more, which is maybe a good thing, because like in my 20s I was so quick to get into debates, and I think a lot of people hate that, and now I have like an outlet for it. It isn't like civil dinner parties when people are trying to have a nice time. All right, kick it off.
All right, so we're chatting about Chapter 2, the nature of philosophical problems and their roots in science. And I don't know about you, reading this chapter is kind of funny. It's an odd experience because Popper, as we've discussed previously, is sort of against talking about the nature of like certain disciplines, or like what characterizes certain disciplines. What is the discipline's essence? And, the chapter 2 of his book is the nature of philosophical problems. And he is sort of defensive about it right off the bat. You can sort of tell.
Exactly.
Right off the bat, he says, we shouldn't be asking these kind of questions. This is kind of silly, right? Like, I don't want to be asking, what is science? What is philosophy? He thinks the role of philosophers is to solve philosophical problems. But he feels backed into trying to defend philosophy and the fact that there are actual philosophical problems by what he views as an attack on it, largely by Wittgenstein. And so we're going to get into the background between him and Wittgenstein. But it's a funny chapter to read, because he first says we shouldn't be discussing these kind of problems. This is silly, but I feel obliged basically to actually defend philosophy as a discipline because it's come under attack. And classically in this chapter, Popper is trying to walk the line between some philosophy which he acknowledges has sort of gone off the rails, namely like certain forms of continental philosophy and like Hegelianism and whatnot. So there he sort of acknowledges that some philosophy has sort of become useless. But he's a firm defender of philosophy and its ability to like help us answer questions and make progress. And he feels like certain members, namely Wittgenstein and his followers, and like places like the Vienna Circle and stuff, have sort of started attacking philosophy as like meaningless, and that the only true disciplines are like pure sciences or math, and that these are the only things that are actually meaningful, and like other philosophical questions like talking about democracy and stuff is actually just meaningless. It's sort of meaningless babble. And so this chapter is him trying to defend the fact that there are actually philosophical problems. But to do that, he has to start talking about sort of what philosophy is, and which you can sort of tell just makes him uncomfortable. Like he's sort of
I think at some point he's like, I'm boring my audience, and so we shouldn't talk about this anymore, but I didn't bring it up, and this is Wittgenstein's problem. He literally says like, this is Wittgenstein's problem.
I'm sorry to do this to you, but I must. I feel like I must.
It's so funny to see like kind of the humanness of Popper kind of coming through in these certain sentences, because you can imagine like he did what I tend to do, which is the first draft is like just fuming, and then keep softening it, but then you can kind of see some of the hints of the fumes in this version. But yeah, totally. So I can maybe say a few words just to set up like what he's going to do and why he's going to do it. And I think for this particular chapter, we should talk a decent amount about the relationship between Popper and Wittgenstein, because that is very relevant. But so maybe I'll give a high level overview of the whole chapter and its goals, and then we should definitely kind of dive into each piece. Nice. I think this is one of these chapters which is like hard to read.
Do you think that before he brings up the examples, I admit, so the examples he goes into later in the chapter are a little bit hard to read, but I thought before that it was actually very
excellent. Totally. No, I agree. Yeah, it was the examples that took me some time, but high level overview. So the situation is that Wittgenstein has been saying that there do not exist philosophical problems. This irks Popper because Popper's whole epistemology is that everything starts with problems. Then Popper's going to try to make the opposite case, but he's going to do so with the help of two examples. He's going to use the first example of Plato. It's called Plato and the Crisis in Early Greek Atomism. And that's going to actually take up a huge chunk of the chapter. And he's actually putting forth a novel hypothesis. So I think part of the reason that bit is hard to read is because he's speaking to other philosophers who have studied the pre-Socratics, taught themselves Greek, as Popper has done. And he's actually putting forth something new and providing historical examples of it. And therefore, for people like ourselves who don't speak Greek and aren't enmeshed in the details of the debates amongst pre-Socratic philosophers, some of what he says seems to me to be evidence for what he's saying. And if you aren't in that debate, then you perhaps don't need to know all of the little details of evidence. But that's I think part of the reason it's there.
I didn't realize he taught himself Greek. What a fucking badass.
Yeah. And then the second example is Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason. And so in the middle of this chapter, there's going to be two significant digressions, which are there to provide examples and evidence for his claim that there do, in fact, exist philosophical problems. And the reason he cares so much about this is because if there weren't philosophical problems, he wouldn't be a philosopher. The only reason he is interested in philosophy is because he thinks there are genuinely problems to figure out. And to the extent that philosophy doesn't have philosophical problems, he's not interested in philosophy. So.
Nice. Yeah. I deliberately did not read the examples, so I'm hoping to play the audience member that can just ask you questions as you're explaining and keep bugging you to clarify things. So hopefully that works out well. We should say as well, when Popper's talking about, he's arguing that there are philosophical problems. It might be worth spending a minute just discussing what does he mean by philosophy here? Because at the beginning, he spent some time arguing that he doesn't believe there are just self-contained disciplines and there are problems that are only philosophical in nature or only biological, right? So he's fully aware that when we're just using the labels philosophy or other disciplines, sociology, anthropology, physics, these are basically just labels that we've started associating with certain tools, certain techniques, certain problems, and that we're separating these departments largely for administrative need, I think he says, on university campuses and stuff. And so he doesn't think there are problems that are uniquely philosophical and then ones that are uniquely about chemistry, say, and then these are completely distinct from one another and no one studying chemistry has anything to say about philosophy and vice versa. Vaden is choking up because I'm so profound at the moment.
I was going to edit that part out, but now I have to keep it.
And but what he does argue is that there are problems that philosophers that have just for convenience, they've called themselves philosophers, but there are problems that they've been concerned with for some time that he does think warrant real discussion or are real problems, and that a lot of the Wittgensteinian sort of credos would try and do away with to say this is meaningless. And he's trying to argue against that there are problems that philosophers for a while have been concerned with, the organization of a state, etc. And that these do constitute real problems that we should be concerned with trying to solve.
When I was reading this, it was an insight I had already downloaded from Sam Harris, but I didn't. This phrase, I didn't appreciate that Popper got there first. That Sam had talked a lot about how what we now consider to be different disciplines are really just a artifact of university campuses and architectural convenience and administrative convenience. But Popper actually got there first, and this is going to lead nicely to section 2 of the chapter, because perhaps one of the big gulfs between disciplines is the gulf between science and philosophy. And I think this is it's less of a gulf, say, between geology and engineering or between art and history. But between science and philosophy, there does seem to be a huge gulf.
I mean, it's a hard chapter to wrap your entire mind around at once. There's a lot going on. But, so I think we might have talked about this quote before, but just a nice phrase that I think sums up Popper's position here is that, we are not students of some subject matter, but students of problems. So the problems come first. We're concerned with how the world works or what we should do about some problem we're faced with. And then disciplines arise out of this because there's people focusing on similar sorts of problems, and then similar sorts of techniques start to get used, and you develop a framework and theories and an intellectual apparatus for how to deal with certain kinds of problems. And this sort of naturally evolves into something we might call like disciplines, but the problems themselves are interdisciplinary, and there's no reason you can't tackle any problem with any set of techniques. There's no techniques that are singly suited for a problem, and that's all there is to say about it.
So what both Popper and Wittgenstein agree on is that scientific problems totally exist. So examples of scientific problems, one he gives is just a geologist trying to find deposits of oil or uranium. Even mundane problems like how do we fix a bicycle tire. And it's so cool once you realize that like everything starts with problems, because I realized I could just like look around my room and every single thing inside my room is there because it solves some sort of problem. Like the laptop that I'm on, the mirror that's to the left of me, like every object in your room, you can ask, why is it there and what problem does it solve? Including the room itself and the walls and the ceiling, right? Like it's all just starts with problems, and then people develop things to fix these problems. But Wittgenstein says, yes, of course, science has problems, but philosophy doesn't. And so I think when we're interrogating the question of are there philosophical problems, or what is the character of philosophical problems, it's important to keep in mind that we're contrasting this against scientific problems that everybody agrees exist. So perhaps before we get into what Popper says, the listener should just ask themselves, like, do philosophical problems exist in juxtaposition to scientific ones, like finding oil or figuring out the atomic structure of the atom? And what is your answer to that? Because that question, I think, is an interesting one. And what Wittgenstein is going to want to say is the answer is no. And thus, all of philosophy is meaningless pseudo-babble.
Those are Popper's words, though.
That's true.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to be talking a lot about Wittgenstein, I guess. So it's probably good to know something about his background. So contrasting actually Popper's and Wittgenstein's background is fun. It's fun to do. So they're both Austrian. They're both born in Austria. Popper's a little bit younger than Wittgenstein, I think, but they're born like same era, sort of growing up like pre-World War I believe. And Wittgenstein comes from a very wealthy family. So if you're familiar with like the American dynasties, think of like a Rockefeller or like a Kennedy, something like that. So, you know, his father is a steel manufacturer, or at least like it basically controls the steel manufacturing happening in Austria, and therefore is like one of the wealthiest families. And Wittgenstein, so, you know, has a very wealthy childhood, is like elite, you know, the elite of the elite. He's considered a child prodigy, but his dad is like very domineering. So Wittgenstein, of his he had four brothers, 3 of them committed suicide, and sort of cited their dads. It seemed like they couldn't live up to their father's expectations. So there's some, you know, family, and Wittgenstein himself sort of expressed suicidal thoughts apparently at times. So like sort of a troubled person, but like Popper, apparently is very difficult to get along with. So both Popper and Wittgenstein are just kind of assholes, regardless of philosophy, like very domineering in conversation. And Wittgenstein, while he's at Cambridge later on, cultivates a cult following, basically. So he has students following him around, trying to speak like him, trying to copy his mannerisms. I think famously he carried around vegetables in like a bag with holes in it to try and air the vegetables, and his students would do the same thing. So
I didn't know that. That's hilarious. That's good.
And he would like sort of slap his face and say like "I" or something when he didn't understand something, and his students would start doing the same thing, and sleep on, like, he apparently slept on a very slim bed, and his students would copy this. So like a forceful character that it was very difficult to disagree with, and sort of, but obviously very like intellectually powerful, because he either drove people like into intellectual submission or just drove them crazy. That's just, they couldn't deal with him anymore.
And people also would contrast his personality to Popper's in the sense that he was quite, I think, humorous, and he was the life of the party in some cases and had like a sense of humor, where Popper tend to be much more
cranky.
Yeah, great word. Cranky. Great word. Yeah.
But so he still had a tendency to like take, so like I think they called it the Moral Sciences Club at Cambridge at the time, which was like the Student Philosophy Society, and he had to be asked to stop coming to these meetings because he would just like take over the entire discussion. Okay, so So very wealthy, sort of like very smart, but also like sails through life, like goes to Cambridge, etc. Popper, on the other hand, is like practical, but very social, but very cranky. And sort of, it seems like throughout his life, he sort of has a chip on his shoulder that he wants to prove, right? So he doesn't actually get his first teaching appointment, I think, at LSE until like mid 40s or something. Before that, he does apply to posts at like Cambridge, but doesn't get them. And then he has to go to New Zealand during the war. Finally gets a post at the London School of Economics, LSE, at like mid 40s, and is still trying to sort of make a name for himself at that time. So I think, he feels maybe that he's been shortchanged a bit. He has been, he's produced Open Society and Its Enemies. And anyway, so there's definitely a difference in personality, but also background of these like two characters. And their approach to philosophy obviously couldn't be more different. So Wittgenstein is very concerned with like language use. Like, how is it that you and I are able to actually communicate things with one another? And his first attempt at resolving this is, Popper actually goes into this in the chapter. So he's sort of Bertrand Russell, who's like a philosophical giant at the time, also at Cambridge, has this classification of like the expressions of language into true statements, false statements, and meaningless statements. So three things. So true and false statements would be things that like make sense. Like, 2 + 2 is 5. Or the cat is an arachnid or something like that, right? So those are false statements, but if you take the negation of those, they're true, right? So 2 + 2 is not 5. The cat is not an arachnid, right? So those are sensical statements to make. They just happen to be false. But then there's also meaningless statements. So like the cat is the sky, or the sky, And so Russell has this like characterization of language. Then Wittgenstein borrows this, but takes it sort of one step further and wants to apply it to philosophy. And what he tries to do is take this and say, okay, all philosophy falls into this third category. It's meaningless, right? So statements are either like scientific, in which case they can be like, verification was the big thing that he was arguing for. So they can either be like empirically verified, or statements are like tautological, so they're just true, like analytically or by definition. And he puts math in this category, so it's basically a bunch of tautologies or things that are true by definition, just built upon one another. That might, at the beginning, they might not look. It's not clear that they're true by definition, but if you sort of follow the logic backwards, they are. And then says, well, philosophy, like asking if Socrates is immortal and things like this, there's nothing there empirically. You can't verify this. It's not science, right? It's definitely not true by definition. Some of these questions about like how to organize a state or immortality or things like this, like there's nothing true by definition about them. And there's also nothing you can empirically verify. So there's nothing he thinks that is scientific about these things. And so he uses this to say all philosophy is meaningless.
Yeah, and maybe a place to pause here is like, why on earth would Wittgenstein, a philosopher, want to argue that his own discipline is meaningless? And this is part of this project of the Vienna Circle and of empiricism, which the way I think of it is like a transition between theology and mainstream science. There was this empiricism stage.
Nice. Yeah.
Because when you had, say, religion, people said things are true because God said so or what have you. But then there is this period of the empiricists that were very necessary, that were basically saying, no, we need evidence. It needs to be empirically verified for us to say anything about what's true or not. And that's a huge improvement upon, say, divine revelation. But it can go too far. And how it goes too far is by saying anything that isn't susceptible to empirical validation is strictly meaningless.
Yeah.
And Popper is so good because he is going to put forth his falsification criterion as a way to demarcate that which is scientific, so that which can be falsified, from that which is not scientific. But he is very careful not to say that things which aren't verifiable or falsifiable, that does not mean that they're meaningless. No, that does not mean that they're meaningless. And in fact, as a philosopher, he damn well knows that philosophy is meaningful. And so it's kind of in the background of this question of like, do there exist philosophical problems, is the larger question of like, is philosophy important in the first place? And so they're going to be arguing and discussing the question of, do there exist philosophical problems? But what's riding on it is that if the answer is no, then the entire branch of philosophy like the entire branch of human inquiry that we call philosophy should basically just go into the dustbin. Should be considered like alchemy or like astrology. Exactly. It's totally meaningless. And this is what Wittgenstein, a philosopher, is claiming. And this is one of the things which distinguishes Popper from other members of the Vienna Circle. And who else is in the Vienna Circle? I know there's like Popper and like Ernest Mach and Wittgenstein.
Or not Popper, you mean? Right?
Sorry, not Popper. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. But was the Vienna Circle focused mainly around Wittgenstein? Do you know?
So I should look up the name right now, but one of the founding members of so we should say Wittgenstein published these thoughts that we've just gone over in a book called the Philosophicus Tractatus, normally just known as the Tractatus. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I've heard the partially examined life people always call it the Tractatus. So
okay, Tractatus. Nice, yeah, we'll go with them. They know their shit.
Yeah.
So in 1922, Hans Hahn, who was one of the leaders of the Vienna Circle, he had students at Vienna University, and he gave them a copy of the Tractatus. Oh God, I'm going to make that mistake all fucking day.
No, I actually don't know which is which, so let's alternate the two. Yep.
Yeah, we'll cover our bases. Yeah, we'll just say it every which way. And so that was sort of the founding document, quote unquote. So Wittgenstein sort of came up with this, and then researchers at the University of Vienna were like, wow, this is a great idea, and sort of started building logical positivism around Wittgenstein's ideas. Of course, after publishing the Tractatus, Wittgenstein left academia because he thought he had solved all the philosophy, right? Because now that you've given an ultimate characterization, right? Either things are science, they're tautologically true, or they're nonsense, and now you can leave, right? Your job is done. So
that I did not appreciate that for the man to be self-consistent after publishing this, he has to stop doing philosophy. Yeah. That is hilarious. I mean, I didn't think about that. Yeah, but
so to be even more self-consistent, he realized that philosophizing about philosophy was itself meaningless. And so he has this analogy where he says that the Tractatus is like a ladder that allows you to step outside the morass of confusing philosophy, use it to see what is before you, namely to realize the philosophy is meaningless, and then cast aside the ladder. So as soon as you've understood what's in the Tractatus, now you no longer need it because it itself is now meaningless. So he's very committed to his position. That is so he leaves. One of the things he does during this time is goes to build a house, help his sister build a house. And while he's doing this, he gets focused on the height of one of the rooms in the house and argues that it has to be elevated 3 centimeters above what it is. So they have to basically tear down the whole house and raise that into this room by 3 centimeters, at which point it's perfect.
That is so funny.
Yeah, so he is a character for sure. Yeah. But then he actually then goes to war. So and like find himself in the trenches in Italy and stuff, and gets arrested, goes to an Italian prison, and in prison is like corresponding with Bertrand Russell and other philosophy dons at Cambridge are like, can you get me out of prison, please?
Is that where he wrote the Tractatus?
You're right. So this is slightly before. Yeah, sorry, you're right. You're right. So he comes out of prison, is able to go to like a cabin and finish it. I think with the help of G.E. Moore, who actually he's made fun of before, and G.E. Moore finds him, who's another philosopher at Cambridge, and is like a huge philosopher, but has said he's intimidated by Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein has this remark where he says like Moore is an example of how far you can get in life with absolutely no intelligence whatsoever. So he's like, he has said this to Moore's face. And Moore still comes out to help him write up the Tractatus as soon as he's out of prison. So anyway, so he publishes this book and then leaves philosophy. Except he then comes back like 10 years later, 7 years later, because he realized he's made a few mistakes. So when you start reading about Wittgenstein, there's like a difference between Wittgenstein pre and post Tractatus. So, he publishes this thing, he claims he solved philosophy, and then goes to do some other things. Namely, he teaches at a school for a while and then realizes he's missed some things. So he's come back. So there's this classic like Wittgenstein 1 and Wittgenstein 2. And the reason this related to this chapter is because at the time when Popper and Wittgenstein actually meet and get an engagement, it's unclear if Popper has realized that Wittgenstein has like changed his views a little bit which might have led to some of the clashing. But the distinction between Wittgenstein 1 and Wittgenstein 2 is slightly subtle. But basically Wittgenstein 1, right, he's like done this sort of dogmatic characterization of language into these three domains. Wittgenstein 2 now realizes that language is actually sort of just a tool used by humans, and that to when you analyze language, to understand how it's being used, you have to understand the situation, the context in which humans are using it. And this gives rise to the famous term language games. So he thinks now, instead of understanding language at like sort of just an objective level, like this is precisely what words and terms mean, this is what they're referring to, this is how people use language, he realizes it's a much more subjective experience for people. And so when you and I are talking, we're engaged in a sort of language game. And the point of philosophy now is to solve these games, right? Which he calls, so this is what he calls puzzles, right? So he thinks the confusion that arises when people are talking to one another is a result of us playing different language games. So we might be using similar words, but we mean different things, or we're referring to different contexts. And that the true philosophical problems, what other people are calling problems, are not problems at all. They're just puzzles with language. They're just like, they're just confusions about how we're using language. So I think one good example I heard recently was like, if someone asks, what time is it on Mars? That is just born of a confusion of how we use the concept time, right? Yeah. Time is like inherently heliocentric, I guess, right? It's inherently has to do with the concept of Earth and how often it rotates around the sun, et cetera. Yeah. And so to just ask that question, it's meaning, right? It's you have to understand in the context in which it's being asked. And so anyway, so now he just thinks, so this is where his whole like language, all philosophy is just like, it's just puzzles, right? It's just like, it's a puzzle about how you and I are speaking to each other, how we're miscommunicating. And like, now we just have to resolve this language game. And so this is where he starts talking about the absence sort of like true philosophical problems. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the famous poker incident. So Wittgenstein is teaching at the University of Cambridge. He's a professor, and he oversees what they call the Moral Science Club, which is the philosophy club, basically. And they invite lecturers to give presentations on topics they would like. And they sent Popper, who was a professor at LSE, I think, at the time, an invitation that said, like, would you like to come give a talk about some philosophical puzzle? It says that explicitly. And you can imagine that this riles Popper up, right? So Popper shows up at like just basically fuming already and launches into a tirade about just the use of the word puzzle there and how it misunderstands the whole enterprise of philosophy and like exactly what we've talked about, right?
And in the room was Bertrand Russell, as well as all of Wittgenstein's disciples. If that's not too loaded. And so to have someone, an outsider, come challenge Wittgenstein, already seen to be like quite a ballsy move.
Yeah, exactly. And so the broad outline of this is Popper starts giving his talk. Wittgenstein starts to get very agitated and starts interrupting. And then him and Popper start arguing back and forth about examples of possible problems. So Popper, throws out the example of like probability, and Wittgenstein dismisses it. Popper throws out the example of democracy, say, and Wittgenstein dismisses it. And then Popper starts talking about morality. And Wittgenstein says, and he's furious at this point. He's like pacing up and down the room, and he's grabbed the poker for the fireplace in the room.
First, it was like a pedagogical tool,
right?
And then it became an actual weapon.
And so then Popper starts talking about morality, and Wittgenstein says, okay, give me an example of an actual normative principle, sort of like sarcastically, right? Because he doesn't really believe in such a thing, because this is meta-ethics, and to him, this is meaningless, pseudo-babble, as you said. Yeah. And then this is where accounts start to diverge. So to Popper fans, Popper says not to threaten visiting lecturers with pokers, at which point Wittgenstein is so mad he throws the poker down and leaves. But the reason this story is so fucking funny is because there's multiple people still alive who remember this encounter, who subsequently wrote into some newspaper in the UK, but all had differing accounts of what actually happened. So some people say Popper did say that to Wittgenstein's face. Some people say Wittgenstein left and then Popper said it. Some people said Popper didn't say anything of the sort. So the whole book is sort of tracing the history of Popper and Wittgenstein and like what actually fucking happened in that room. And it's still sort of unsettled. But obviously it was very important to Popper because he put it in Unending Quest, his autobiography.
Exactly.
So this encounter really made an impression on him.
So what's so great about chapter 2 is that we get to read roughly what Popper came there to say, if not verbatim. Like the arguments that he's putting in this chapter is his response to Wittgenstein.
Nice.
So to get us back to the chapter,
a huge fucking tangent.
That was great. No, it was great. But so now in subsection 3, he's going to defend Wittgenstein's views. So this is what Popper does so beautifully, which is basically it's a tripartite structure of first explicating, then defending, then critiquing. So in defense of his Wittgenstein's view, he's basically going to acknowledge that huge amounts of philosophy are, in fact, meaningless babble. And he credits Wittgenstein for keeping a lot of this meaningless babble at bay. And he traces it specifically to Hegel, where Hegel, I'm just going to quote, "I've promised to say something in defense of Wittgenstein's views. What I wish to say first is that there is much philosophical writing, especially in the Hegelian school, which may justly be criticized as meaningless verbiage. Secondly, that this kind of irresponsible writing was checked, for a time at least, by the influence of Wittgenstein and the language analysts." But then he says, but I'm actually going to go even further. He's going to go beyond Wittgenstein and say that not only are there large chunks of philosophy which do fit his description, but it's actually something which is going to happen to all philosophies if they fail to study things outside of philosophy. So he says that his first thesis is this: genuine philosophical problems are always rooted in urgent problems outside of philosophy, and they die if these roots decay. And I just have to say, in my own life, I have noticed this so much, where the philosophers who I gravitate towards are precisely those who have used their philosophical training to study subjects outside of philosophy. For example, Peter Singer, who has used his talents to take a strong stance on the right to terminate the lives of severely disabled infants,
which he just got canceled for, by the way.
Recently, or is
recently? Yeah, he just got disinvited from a big thing at
I didn't know that.
Some university that I'll put in the show notes that I've been blanking on right now, Tufts or something, like some big. Anyway, yeah,
exactly. But it's like he is studying things outside of philosophy. Popper obviously does this with science, maybe a controversial name in some circles, but
not controversial that he at least wades into real problems. Like if you look at his writing, he's like he's arguing about COVID, challenge trials, etc. Like every current issue, he's got an opinion about and is wading fiercely into. Yeah,
Peter Singer is so good at this, and I contrast him to all of the many philosophers who study the nature of goodness, for example, or the true nature of suffering. And what I think is the mechanism for this philosophical inbreeding is actually, so this isn't Popper's terminology, and this is kind of my speculation, but I think it's like the publish or perish model, because you have to publish repeatedly on problems within your own field. So you have to build upon the literature which has come before you, and you have to make a contribution within your own field. But if your own field isn't focused on problems outside of it, and your publications and what you're studying is simply the mound of literature which is accreted over the last 100 years, this is what he's talking about, because you're just solving problems which have been created by within the own discipline. And that's where you get this philosophical inbreeding. And then he bridges nicely to the second thesis, which is that you have this problem going on, this philosophical inbreeding, where you're solving problems which are only rooted within your own discipline and have no connection to problems outside it. Then what you're going to almost inevitably end up doing is starting to mimic the methods of those who have solved the problems within your own field before. He says this thing at the end of the page 95, which just resonates with me so hard, which is that he says, there are those who feel the urge to solve a problem those for whom a problem becomes real, like a disorder, which they have to get out of their system. These are the people who make contributions because they develop new methods and new techniques in order to just get this urge out of their system. And I was trying to think of an example of something that I could say to the audience that would give them maybe some taste of what this feels like. And I came up with one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hopefully give you a problem that doesn't make sense, and I'm not going to tell you the answer. And the answer is available on Google, and you can Google it. But try not to Google it and see how long you can last. And I think some people, they're going to hear this and they're going to say like, oh, interesting, and just kind of go about their day. And there are other people who are going to think about it for a while and just be like, okay, and then just have to Google the answer. But the question is about mirrors. And so it came from Richard Feynman.
Oh, I fucking heard this. Yeah. So good.
Which is the question is, why do mirrors flip things horizontally and not vertically? So when you put text in front of the mirror, it flips it left to right, but it doesn't flip it upside down. And the question is why? And yeah, so the question is why? Why doesn't it flip things? Why doesn't it flip things upside down? And I'm not going to say the answer, but to the audience who finds this curious, just think about it for a bit and imagine that there was no Google to figure it out for you, and just sit with that feeling. And that's what the feeling of like real research feels like. It's just this irritation that you should know something, but you don't know the answer. And it's like, there has to be an answer, but you can't rest until you figure it out. And so Popper's going to contrast that feeling, that urge to solve problems, with another approach to research, which is the application of a method. So the repeated application of a method. For example, the method of oppression dynamics. You can take the core insight from Marx that you can have systemic oppression, say, of a particular class. And then you can just apply that to everything over and over again. You can apply it to, like, I heard something about like family privilege.
Dude, I heard the same thing. Oh my God.
Like, you should say it to for the audience, but like,
I'll try and find the link again. I can't even remember what it was from, but something about family. Yeah, family.
Yeah, just if you have a family, you're privileged.
We need to dismantle family privilege.
But this is the application of a technique, right?
Yeah.
This is this notion of privilege makes a lot of sense in some contexts. Let's just apply this concept to everything. Let's just apply it to families. Let's apply it to race. Let's apply it to body size. Let's just apply it. Contrast against the urge to figure out. And that's what Popper's getting at. And now zoom out a little bit and get out of the weeds. So again, Popper is saying that he's going further than Wittgenstein. He's saying that philosophy, a lot of it can be meaningless, and it's meaningless for a reason. And the reason is he has two theses. The first thesis is that it's because if you have a philosophy which is not attached to problems outside it, it becomes inbred. And then his second thesis is about teaching methodology.
Yeah, nice. So his first thesis was exactly what you just laid out. His second thesis then takes this insight and applies it to how we typically teach students, or how a lot of departments teach students about philosophy and just subjects in general. So he says, the normal method of teaching philosophy is you go back and you read these texts from these famous philosophers, whether it's Hegel, whether it's Plato, whether it's Socrates, and you sort of just stew in them, and you look at the language that's used and you analyze it and you conjecture about what they were doing. And he says what's missing from this is the focus on problems. So, why these texts were influential at the time is because they had particular problems in mind that they were trying to solve. And by focusing first and foremost on the text themselves, you're ignoring the most important part of this equation, right? You're forgetting the context in which these books and essays and texts were written. And you're just getting students to ponder over basically what amounts to like just meaningless verbiage, right? And just like you learn how their argumentative techniques, and you tie them. I think he says you tie yourself up in their curious knots, right? And you learn what sort of techniques they used and what your professors like to see, and then you start applying that in your own essays, and you use the same techniques over and over again, and then that sort of leads you into a class of professional philosophers who is then just worried about the application of sort of these techniques that they picked up as undergraduates and graduate students, right? And you've sort of forgotten the original motivation for these texts in the first place, which is they were trying to solve like real problems. Even if we have solutions to those problems now, right? What motivated them at that point was problems. And god damn, does this resonate with me? It's just in terms of how undergrad went, right? Like you just, even outside of philosophy, you're just often taught like technique after technique, and you sort of forget like what the hell is motivating these techniques in the first place.
The listener may not have been in philosophy seminars, but this is exactly what the listener has had done to them in their education of just mathematics in elementary school and in junior high and in high school. Because what are you taught? You're taught how to solve polynomials. Are you taught why you should learn how to solve polynomials? No. Are you taught where you're going to apply these polynomials? No, you're just taught to memorize these stupid formula. And then everyone leaves the class thinking they're not math people. But really, it's a consequence of their not being good math teachers. Completely agree. I think it's just such a brilliant insight. And to go back to Wittgenstein, Popper ends this little section by saying that he feels that we ought to respect the man who, having made his efforts, comes ultimately to what may be described as Wittgenstein's conclusion. I have learned the jargon as well as anybody. It's very clever and captivating. In fact, it's dangerously captivating. For the simple truth about the matter is that it is much ado about nothing, just a lot of nonsense. And that's fairly high praise, right? Because what he's saying here is that those who have spent 10, 15 years learning these tricks and learning the jargon, only to find that the field, the subdiscipline of philosophy, let me back up a tiny little bit, which is to say, we've been using examples of mathematics and computer science where you learn the jargon and then you learn the substantial idea underneath. But there are schools of philosophy. I'm not going to give examples because every example I give will piss off some subset of the... So just to the listener, whatever school of philosophy you personally don't like is probably what Popper has in mind. But there are schools where it's just the jargon. It's just the techniques, and there's actually nothing underneath, where you learn over 10, 15 years how to reproduce the jargon. And then Popper's celebrating those who, after learning this, acknowledge that it's just a lot of nonsense, as Wittgenstein has done. And he's giving high praise to Wittgenstein, which I think is true and important. Okay, so where were we? Let's keep cruising.
Do you want to go into the specific problems that he the examples rather, that he uses to fortify his position that there are indeed philosophical problems?
I think this is a good place to summarize and reset to get us to the second chunk of the chapter, which is quite meaty. So to summarize so far, Popper's challenging Wittgenstein's claim that philosophy doesn't have any problems and it's all meaningless. But he started by emphasizing points of agreement. So the points of agreement with Wittgenstein is that actually there is a lot of philosophy which is meaningless and does fit Wittgenstein's description. And he's diagnosed two causes. Cause number one is this philosophical inbreeding. So it's philosophizing without recourse to the outside world, to problems outside of philosophy. And two, it's a consequence of poor methodology, which does not stress what, in Popper's terminology, is the problem situation. So now he's going to start to diverge with Wittgenstein. And he's going to say, listen, I'm just going to show you two examples of what I consider to be genuine philosophical problems. And I'm not only going to show them to you, but I'm going to try to demonstrate my second thesis, which is the best way to show you the problem is to set up the problem situation. And I'm also going to not only demonstrate the second thesis, but I'm also going to emphasize the first point that I made, which is that a problem doesn't stay in any particular discipline. So what starts as philosophy is going to eventually become atomic physics. And so his first example is going to be tracing the legacy of atomism, and tracing how what started as a philosophical problem in philosophy became atomic physics. And so that's going to be his first example. And his first example is large and detailed. And the reason it's large and detailed is because he's trying to do exactly what he just said isn't typically done, which is he's trying to set up the problem situation. So let's go into the first example. But does that make sense so far?
Beautiful. Yeah, let's fucking do it. I'm excited.
Yeah. So, but the story, as I understand it, is he's going to talk about the crisis which came about with the discovery of the irrationality of the square root of 2. So the first philosophical problem which he's highlighting is the discovery of the square root of 2. And you say, why is that such a philosophical problem? Well, it's because of Pythagoras. So what Pythagoras did is he discovered the musical ratios, these beautiful musical ratios. And so, did you ever play guitar?
No, I didn't.
One thing that I would teach my guitar students when I was still teaching is harmonics. And so there may be some listeners who play guitar. And for listeners who do play guitar, they should know about harmonics, which is you put your finger over, let's say, the 12th fret of the low E string, and you pluck it, and it makes this like resonant sound. And then you can put your finger over the 7th fret and over the 5th fret. And what you're actually doing when you do a harmonic is it's like you have a skipping rope held by 2 people, and 2 people are spinning the skipping rope. And then you have a third person come in and clamp it right in the middle. And so now you have 2 pieces of the skipping rope spinning, but in the middle section, that part's not moving. And that's what happens when you play harmonic. And what you're doing is you're taking the full string and you're dividing it into 2 pieces. When you divide it into 2 pieces, what you get is a perfect octave. And it sounds, so that's the first ratio, is this perfect octave. And then you can move your finger over to the 7th fret. When you do that, and you pluck it again, what you get is, imagine 3 equal chunks of the skipping rope, or in this case, the guitar string. And so you divide the string into 2, you get a perfect octave. And you divide the string into 3 pieces, you get a perfect 5th. And if you divide the string into 4 pieces, you get a perfect 4th. And this is what Pythagoras discovered.
Wait, and in the skipping rope example, is the rope rotating at the exact same time?
So that's what's
like they're symmetric. The 2 sides.
Yeah, so that's what's so trippy about harmonics in particular, which is different than if you actually just like push the fret. Here, let me just grab my guitar. I'll just show you.
Yeah, nice. We're getting fucking multimedia here.
Sorry, I'll just show you. So if you do this, that's a harmonic.
Oh, so you let it off right away.
Yeah. So that would be a perfect octave, and then you go, and then compared to, so I'll be fretting it, and then you go.
So this is equivalent to someone just like clamping their rope in the middle, then letting go, and then the 2 sides are...
Exactly. Yeah. So if you do like the 7th fret, then there's a spot over here that isn't vibrating. And you can actually find it there. Hear how that sounds the same?
Damn.
So what you have are these parts of the string that aren't moving while the rest of it is. And that's just a property of... music. But that's what Pythagoras discovered.
Pythagoras was in a boy band.
Yeah. So what he discovered, if you take a single string and you divide it into 1/2 or 2/3 or 3/4, you get pleasing harmonies coming out. And this he took, so he has this idea that dividing a single string into whole numbers produces something crazy, which is pleasing harmonies. So you have 1/2 for the perfect octave, you have 2/3 for the perfect 5th, and then you have 3/4 for perfect 4th. And any other ratio would sound poor. He also discovered you could do this with triangles too. So you have a special triangle like 3, 4, 5, where the hypotenuse is length 5 and the 2 sides are length 3, 4. So what he did was he generalized this to everything. He said that the entire universe is based upon whole numbers or ratios of whole numbers.
I see. And this fucked up the square root of 2.
The square root of 2 is going to fuck up this, right?
Right, yeah. Or rather,
because, so he's going to take this idea that everything is about whole numbers or ratios of whole numbers, and generalize it to, I think he has like a whole cosmological theory called, Musica Universalis.
Oh, wow, no way.
Musica Universalis. Literally universal music, also called the music of the spheres or the harmony of the spheres. Okay, so that's what we have to keep firmly in mind. At this time in this area of the world, people were super stoked on whole numbers and ratios of whole numbers because of this discovery.
Nice.
That's
Okay.
the core thing. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
This insight is going to be useful to make progress on another problem which fascinated the pre-Socratics, and that's called the problem of change. The problem of change. It sounds almost kind of silly to say it now, like how come things change? But Popper does a good job of establishing why this is actually like a legit problem. So it happens to be a problem which the pre-Socratics were obsessed about. Mm-hmm. And this is why you have like Heraclitus saying that everything is change, that you can't step in the same river twice. It's all change all the time. And then you have Parmenides saying nothing is change. It's all static. And why do they keep talking about change? Because they're thinking about the problem of change. And what's the problem of change? If a thing X changes, it's clearly not the same thing X. On the other hand, we cannot say that thing X changes without implying that there is an X that persisted across the change, that is the same thing X at the beginning of the change and at the end of the change. Thus, it appears we arrive at a contradiction, and the very idea of a thing changing, therefore the idea of change, is impossible. It's not a bad formulation of the problem, right? Which is, how can we say that something has changed if we aren't simultaneously saying that it's the same thing or it's not the same thing?
So maybe related to aging or something to make it more concrete, right? So like if you, Vaden, are aging, so, you know, at the beginning of your 19th year and your 27th year, if you are, if you're still Vaden, then how can you be changing? But if you are different between your 19th and your 27th year, then how can we still call you Vaden? You might be a different thing. Yeah.
He says this exact thing at the bottom of footnote 26. That,
no way.
The idea of like change and essentialism, because essentialism is one answer to the problem of change, but doesn't change is the inner essence, is due to the connection with anthropomorphism, because substances take their plausibility from the experience of a self, identical but changing and unfolding. So it's this idea that we have a constant self, which is immutable throughout change, throughout the change, which is the thing which gave rise to this problem in the first place. So how would you solve the problem of change? Think about it for a sec, and think about the audience should think about it too, right? Like, what's the answer to this question? Because it's a real problem. So let's put you on the spot. The answer is this idea that what you have are indivisible things that don't change, and it's the arrangement of these things, these unchanging things in a changing universe, which gives the appearance of change.
This is atomism.
This is atomism. Yeah. So maybe I'll just read a quote from Popper to keep us grounded here. Middle of page 107, he says, the main point about this theory is that it gives a rational account of change. The world consists of empty space, the void, with atoms in it. The atoms don't change. They are Parmenidean, indivisible block universes in miniature. And all change is due to rearrangements of atoms in space. Accordingly, all change is movement. So we have this idea that you have indivisible atoms moving around a void, and that all change is movement. And you also have this notion from Pythagoras that the universe consists of natural numbers or their ratios. And so later in this section, Popper says, let us look back for a moment at the characteristics of this method of natural numbers and their ratios. Pythagoras' emphasis upon number was fruitful from the point of view of the development of scientific ideas. But what I want to emphasize is that for Pythagoreans, all measuring was counting. So counting and measuring were the same. And so the problem of the irrationality of the square root of 2 is that it destroyed all of this progress. Because once you discover that you have something which is fundamental, if you draw a triangle of length 1 and length 1, the two sides, then inescapably you arrive at the conclusion that the length of that, the measurement of the hypotenuse, cannot be a ratio. It cannot be a ratio of natural units or natural numbers. So end of part 7 of this chapter, Popper writes the following. There's little doubt that the realization that irrational magnitudes existed, and then he says in parentheses, they were of course not recognized as numbers. This undermined the faith of the Pythagorean order. It destroyed the hope of deriving cosmology, even geometry, from the arithmetic of natural numbers. And this is the philosophical problem, which Popper's highlighting. And then he celebrates Plato for recognizing this fact and for, in his laws, stressing its importance in the strongest possible terms, and denouncing his compatriots for their failure to gauge its implications. And then Popper says, I suggest that Plato's main contribution to science sprang from his realization of the problem of the irrational and from the modification of Pythagoreanism and atomism, which he personally undertook in order to rescue science from a catastrophic situation. So this is high praise, and rightly so. And it again shows that Popper's much more nuanced than people remember him to be. And so what does Plato do? What Plato does is that he realized that, in fact, geometry is fundamental, not arithmetic. So flipping this idea from the Pythagoreans that say that counting is the fundamental thing, Plato flips it and says that no, in fact, geometry is fundamental. And out of Plato's school comes Euclid and Euclid's axioms and the study of Euclidean geometry. And now it's decently recognized that geometry is at the heart of mathematics. And this can be traced to Plato. So to maybe zoom out for a second, just remind ourselves why we're talking about this, because I think that's one of the dangers of this chapter. Popper's obviously doing much more than simply giving an example of a philosophical problem. He's trying to demonstrate his teaching methodology as well, that one cannot simply just memorize all of these pre-Socratics because I took a course in pre-Socratic philosophy. That was like one of the few philosophy courses I actually took. And this is exactly how it was taught to me. Just here's 10 names. I'm just going to tell you the facts about each of these 10 people and memorize it. But Popper's establishing why they came about, why these ideas, which seem kind of crazy now, why they came about, and not only why they came about, but how they have influenced our thinking into the present day. And he's further demonstrating how we are not students of disciplines, but students of problems, right? It isn't the case that you can take one problem like the irrationality of the square root of 2 and say that is a math problem, or that's a philosophy problem, or that's a physics problem, because it's all like there are no disciplines. And that's so in his chunk of this chapter, I think part of the reason it's difficult to read is I think he's trying to do a little bit too much at once. And he's trying to emphasize he's trying to demonstrate all the things that he'd said in the first part of the chapter. And that can kind of have as a consequence, people just glaze over it and skip past it, as I did many, many times. But once you actually see like the main threads of the story, it's really cool, or at least I thought it was really cool. And that basically concludes his first example.
I'm so curious what Wittgenstein would have said to this. I want to know what he would have I'm just too partial to Popper, I think. So I can't give Wittgenstein a good defense, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe
it's hard to argue against, right?
Yeah.
So somewhere he does talk about how Wittgenstein's language analysis, how he just can describe things as meaningless if they're not empirically verified, would have strangled in the crib the differential and integral calculus.
So
right?
Nice, yeah. And I mean, basically any theory at its origins.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No. That's it. So like, although we can't say what Wittgenstein would have said to his example, we can at least conjecture a little bit what he would have done to the integral and differential calculus in the early stages, when it's just unclear, it's vague, it's inchoate, it's imprecise, and it's just people trying to understand things. But over time, it becomes precisified, it becomes built upon, and it becomes atomic physics and mathematics.
And what original thought is not sort of nonsense at the beginning, right? It's very rare that an original idea does not have some contradictions built in, or some tautologies, or is kind of not well defined enough to actually apply to anything right at the beginning. It's just a vague intuitional sense, and then you build it more and more. But yeah, if you were to apply Wittgenstein's criterion right at the beginning, you'd have to throw it out as meaningless. Although Wittgenstein, it's unclear. Maybe he would have said, well, it's meaningless, but it's still okay to think about up to the point where it's meaningful. I'm not sure, but that's why Popper's separation of like the meaningful criteria from like the difference between science and non-science was such a stroke of insight, right? Like everyone was trying to bundle these things together about like truth and falsity and what's meaningful and what's not, and all of these things were supposed to be one criteria, right? Trying to like truth and falsity and what's meaningful, but Popper like wanted to completely separate these things. You know, he didn't want to ever give a criteria of meaningfulness because he thought, just like you said, you know, like things are meaningful in different contexts, and who are we to say that certain art or something, even if full of contradictions, is not meaningful? And it just wasn't interested in that question at all.
Exactly. Nice. So we're almost done the chapter, but I guess I can finish the second example and then get up before we pass out from exhaustion. but so the second example he chooses is Immanuel Kant. And basically the problem that Mr. Kant was interested in is that he was influenced by two people, Isaac Newton and David Hume. And David Hume taught that you could not have any such thing as certain knowledge. You couldn't have knowledge of universal laws. And we've talked about this with like the problem of induction, which is that when you observe something, you only see a singular instance. And so how can we possibly get theoretical knowledge of things we haven't seen? How can looking at one swan tell us anything about all swans? But on the other hand, Newton. On the other hand, F equals MA seems to be pretty
damn accurate when it comes
pretty damn accurate and pretty damn general and pretty damn universal.
And Kant did think this was the universal description, right? Like he thought this was absolute. Yeah. This is an absolute description of how the universe worked, right?
Exactly. So the famous thing you learn about Hume and Kant is Hume roused Kant from his dogmatic slumbers. So Hume roused Kant to the fact that there was basically a problem of knowledge. Here was a problem that could not be dismissed. How could a man get hold of such knowledge? Knowledge which was general, precise, mathematical, demonstrable, and indubitable, yet capable, like Euclidean geometry, and yet capable of giving causal explanations of observed facts. And this is basically his example of a second philosophical problem, the problem of knowledge. How can both these things be true? And so just to end, because I know we've been going on for a while and it's mainly been me soliloquizing on this chapter, so I apologize, but there's just a really beautiful chunk that I want to read, and then we'll maybe close on that. But so the quote that I want to read from Popper to end is, so first he reformulates Kant's question. So he says, not how is knowledge possible, but instead, how are successful conjectures possible? And the answer Popper gives is the following. Because, as you've said, we are not the passive receptors of sense data, but active organisms. Because we react to our environment not always merely instinctively, but sometimes consciously and freely. Because we invent myths and stories and theories. Because we have a thirst for explanation, an insatiable curiosity, a wish to know. Because we not only invent stories and theories, but we try them out and we see how they work and why they work. Because by a great effort, by trying hard and making many mistakes, we may sometimes, if we are lucky, succeed in hitting upon a story, an explanation, which saves the phenomena, perhaps by making up a myth about atoms or forces which explain the visible. Because knowledge is an adventure of ideas. Because knowledge is an adventure of ideas. God, I just love that.
I'm not crying. You're crying.
Yeah, I'm not crying. You're crying. And so,
nice.
So this is his answer, and this is the resolution, and that is chapter 2.
Those were freaking good, man. Those were really good. Yeah, I wouldn't have done that. I probably should have dived in so I could actually keep pace with you, but I was happy just listening and learning from your adventures with those ideas. So,
yeah,
that was nice.
Anyways, well, that was fun, man.
Nice.
To be continued.